and welcome back for another Sheriff of Sodium video. Academic Capitalism, Rethinking the Expansion of Subspecialty Fellowships. So, it wasn't that long ago that I ran into one of our third-year pediatric residents. And I hadn't seen this resident for a bit, so we were chatting, and he said, actually, I've been meaning to email you about setting up a meeting because I wanted to ask you about fellowship applications. And I said, fellowship applications? I thought you were doing general pediatrics. And he said, well, yeah, I am. And he proceeded to explain how he had a job offer at an urgent care center, but he was considering doing a fellowship in pediatric urgent care that was offered by one of the most prestigious children's hospitals in the country. And he wondered what I thought about that. And I said, friend, I could save us both some time. There's no need to set up a meeting. I'm going to tell you what I think about this right now. And that's what I'm going to tell you in this video, so buckle up, because here it is. It's a scam. And I don't mean that the fellowship itself is fraudulent. I'm certain you could learn quite a bit by working in an urgent care center or an emergency department fast track alongside people for whom that is their expertise and their life's work. But the scam, this dishonest scheme that I'm talking about, it isn't about this particular program or even the idea of an urgent care fellowship in general. It is bigger than that. It is a systemic issue that has infiltrated every specialty in medicine. It's this steady increase in creating more and more fellowships and super fellowships and the less than completely honest justifications that are made for them. It's about who really wins and loses when you continue to prolong medical training more and more. It's about how we're permitting a certain type of academic capitalism that benefits those who have seized control of the means of production at the expense of those who are lower on the pyramid. And how, although all of this is usually done in the name of improving patient care, there's usually not a shred of evidence that it does anything of the sort, especially if you were actually to compare it to some of the very realistic and achievable alternatives, which I will discuss explicitly in case they are not self-obvious. So all of that's what I'm going to talk to you about in this video. But two little housekeeping things first. First, for people outside of medicine, I think we forget how opaque our system of training is. And I think there will be some people who watch this video who aren't as familiar with the terms that I'm about to use, so I'm going to give you a very brief TikTok level primer about what I'm talking about. To become a practicing physician, first you go to medical school. When you graduate, you're a doctor. You have an MD or a DO degree. But you can't get a state license to practice medicine without doing some postgraduate training. And so you do that training in the general area in which you want to practice, maybe internal medicine or radiology or ophthalmology. So that initial period of postgraduate medical education, which leads to your ability to be board certified in a particular field of medicine, that's called your residency. And if you want, you can stop training when your residency's over and you can take your specialty boards and you could practice as a general internist or a general radiologist or a general ophthalmologist. But if you want to specialize in geriatrics or abdominal imaging or retinal diseases, then you need to do an additional period of postgraduate training, which is called a fellowship. And many fellowships, they lead to other fellowships. So if you do an internal medicine residency and then become a cardiologist, well, you could still go further by doing another fellowship, an advanced fellowship in electrophysiology or interventional cardiology or cardiac imaging. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about fellowships. I'm talking about these periods of postgraduate medical training that are offered to physicians who are already board certified or board eligible in a general specialty, or those who have completed the training for a specialty within that specialty already. The second thing I need to do is give a content warning of sorts. Talking about these fellowships is necessarily going to require me giving some specific examples. And if you're a physician who practices in one of those specialties, and you stumble upon this video, some of this may hit a little bit close to home. So let me be clear. I'm not saying you're bad or that your specialty is unnecessary. Any of the examples I use, I'm sure I could have chosen a different one. And if it would make you feel better, why don't you just pretend that I did? What I'm talking about here is a systemic issue. What I want to try to do is inspire you to look beyond your subspecialty or really any individual subspecialty and look at our broad system of medical education. And when you do that, what I hope that you'll see is that there are incentives in play here that are natural, and their existence is really beyond dispute. But when those incentives get pursued, either consciously or subconsciously, it leads to a system that doesn't necessarily improve patient care, but does benefit the people and the institutions doing the training. And it imposes significant opportunity costs on trainees. And maybe if that's the end result, we ought to think about building that system in a slightly different way. So let me begin by taking head on the first thing that people usually say to defend the need for their fellowship, which is this. But medicine is getting more specialized. Scientific knowledge continues to expand. Technology continues to improve. It's natural we need more fellowships, right? And of course, I grant that the foundation of this is true. There was a time when we didn't even have residency training because there was only one kind of doctor, and you could learn everything that you needed to know in your 4-year medical education. If you're interested in that history of residency training and how that came to be, I actually have a whole separate video about it, and I'll link to that in the show notes below. The argument that medicine is getting more specialized, it does justify some fellowships. There wasn't any need for OBGYNs to do a reproductive endocrinology fellowship until we had in vitro fertilization or effective medicines for infertility. There wasn't any need for minimally invasive surgery fellowships after you did your general surgery residency until, we had minimally invasive surgical techniques. But the fact that some new area of knowledge exists is not a blanket justification for every fellowship. The appropriate question isn't, is there a new technology? Or is there a new patient population? Or is there a new practice location? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, well, I guess we have to have fellowship. The appropriate question is, given that we have a new technology and techniques and therapeutics and models of care, and given that medicine is and is likely to become an increasingly specialized endeavor, what is the best way to train physicians to get the knowledge and skills that they need to serve that patient population, to use that technique? The question is also not, is this training useful or good? The right questions are, when should this training occur? And how should it occur? And to whom should it be offered? So first, I think you should start by just looking one step back and examine, is it really the case that completing a categorical residency program in a particular specialty leaves you unprepared to provide safe and competent patient care using that technique or caring for that patient population? And I got to be honest, for some specialties, it's a lot easier to convince me than others. You wouldn't have to work very hard to convince me that a fellowship should be required to become a cardiologist. It's just not reasonable to expect that internal medicine residents are going to learn how to read echocardiograms and do cardiac catheterization. It makes perfect sense to set aside teaching those things to a select group of trainees. Similarly, you would not have to work very hard to convince me that a fellowship is necessary to become an oncologist. And it's not that internal medicine residents don't see and care for patients with cancer, they do all the time. But staying up to date and prescribing the latest biologic chemotherapies, that's sort of self-obviously outside the scope of expertise of even the most qualified general internist. Now, I'm a little bit less convinced that 90% of all general surgery and orthopedic surgery residents need to do a fellowship. It's not that I have any doubt that doing transplant surgeries or spine surgeries requires a heck of a lot of expertise. I would happily concede to you that I would want the surgeon doing my liver transplant or my spinal fusion to have done a certain number of cases before they did my case. But if almost all the residents in a given specialty are doing a fellowship, it does beg the question of whether the general residency training is adequate. If these fellowships are necessary, if you aren't qualified to be a foot and ankle surgeon or an acute care general surgeon without doing a fellowship, then why are we allowing 10% of residents to graduate and start doing those things if they really don't have the skill or the case numbers to do them? If a fellowship is necessary for safe practice, it seems like a better educational model would be to build that experience into the categorical residency so that everyone gets the case numbers that they need in the area in which they're actually going to be practicing and operating on people. Of course, that model is only logical under the assumption that the only goal of residency is to be an educational experience that produces competent physicians, and that it's not just, a means to provide cheaper wall-to-wall clinical call coverage or triaging consults or rapidly processing admissions and discharges. And further, you can consider me thoroughly unconvinced that certain fellowships are necessary. The Pediatric Urgent Care Fellowship falls into this category. If completing a 3-year categorical pediatric residency is not sufficient training for an otherwise competent general pediatrician to treat or triage children with minor illnesses in the urgent care center, what is the point of a general pediatric residency? What kind of job could a general pediatrics residency possibly prepare you for? Similarly, I don't know why a well-trained anesthesiology resident would need to spend an extra year in training to become an obstetric anesthesiologist. Uh, I'm not an anesthesiologist. I don't know much about their training, but I kind of would have thought that obstetric anesthesia would be a core component of that categorical training. I mean, if it's not, shouldn't it be? But like I said, these are not my areas of practice, so maybe I'm just out of my depth. Maybe these aren't good examples. So pick some different ones. I'm not a neurologist either, but just for fun, I Googled up the list of available neurology fellowships. And the American Academy of Neurology, they have a fellowship directory on their website that lists, and I'm not making this up, over 30 different types of fellowships that one can pursue after their neurology residency. These are fellowships in autonomic disorders, balance disorders, movement disorders, EEG, EMG, neuroimaging, neurogenetics, neuroendocrinology, neuroophthalmology, neuropsychiatry, neuroinfectious disease, geriatric neurology, neurohospitalist, neurocritical care, headache medicine, pain medicine, sleep medicine, and stroke, just to name a few. And look, I don't doubt, again, that there's a depth of expertise that you could attain in all those fields. I'm sure there's 1,000-page textbooks in each of those disciplines. And maybe all 30 something of them are absolutely necessary. But again, the right question is not, can a fellowship provide information that you could learn? There's always more you could learn. The question is, does your general neurology residency training give you the skills that you need to provide safe and competent patient care? And I get that it can be hard to draw the line. There's few bright lines and a lot of gray when you try to decide what's needed to practice safe and competent medicine. But we have to do it. This is our highest obligation to the public, to ensure that the people who complete medical training are actually competent to do the things that they do. At the same time, there has to be some recognition that there are real harms to just adding more and more fellowships. The obvious harms are to the fellows, who get to spend another 1 to 3 years earning a trainee's salary, or delaying childbearing, or other important life events because they still have no control over their schedule. It hurts people in ways that are measurable. And it's not clear to me that those harms get offset later by better patient care or better outcomes among people who have done these fellowships, especially if you compare doing the fellowship not just to the null hypothesis, but to a system where we tried to maximize the educational value of residency training and ensure that everyone who graduates is competent to do X, Y, or Z in their practice. And to me, all this is obvious. But when I point it out, I frequently get three additional objections. The first one is this, but residency programs, they offer different experiences. Dr. Carmody, you might wish that all residency programs gave their residents the same ideal experience, you sweet summer child, but that's just not going to be the training world that we live in. Maybe there are anesthesiologists who, because of the way their program is structured, they may feel that they need to do some additional epidurals before they go out and do that in their own practice. Or maybe there's pediatric residents who need more reps with evaluating the mildly to moderately ill pediatric patient, and an urgent care fellowship, it makes good sense for them. And maybe, even though it strains credulity to believe, but maybe there are neurology residents who don't get enough experience with headache or stroke or seizure, and it makes perfect sense for them to need some additional training in those areas before they start caring for real patients. And maybe the best solution to any of those problems is not actually to fix the programs and insist that they provide better training. But instead, the best solution is to enable those programs to continue to churn out less than competent residents, as long as we provide an avenue for the most conscientious among them to recognize, that, gosh, I've not been adequately trained, and give those people a pathway to pursue some additional training. I mean, if they want to. I'm not even going to say any additional counter to this. I'm just going to let that argument hang in the air for a moment before I continue. The second objection is this, but these fellowships are for future academicians. Because, here I am telling you about clinical competence, but that's not really the focus of some of these fellowships. I mean, the fellows, they may do some clinical stuff, but the real focus is academic. You don't do an urgent care medicine fellowship just to buff yourself up to work at the urgent care center. You do it because you want to be an academic leader in urgent care medicine. So actually, the fellowship that spawned this video, only 40% of your time is spent doing clinical work. The rest of the time is to help you do research and make a name for yourself in the world of urgent care. Some of the fellowships that on first pass, they may seem completely nonsensical. They start to become understandable when you realize that their goal is to train you as an academic. So, for sake of example, after you complete your residency in general internal medicine, there are a few ivory tower institutions that offer a fellowship in general internal medicine. Now, you don't do that fellowship just because you want to learn more general internal medicine. You do it to establish yourself as a researcher so that you can show that you've contributed to the body of knowledge in the field. And then you can be a professor. And maybe one day you'll become the department chair or the division chief of internal medicine, or dare I say it, the program director for the General Internal Medicine Fellowship. The main value of these fellowships is as a credential. And the main reason that I'm generally opposed to them is because they seem to me like just another example of credentialism. And medicine is far from the only area of society that has this problem with credentialism. If you look at history, many jobs that you used to be able to get without any formal educational whatsoever, uh, now they require a high school diploma. Many jobs that used to require a high school diploma, they now require a college degree. Jobs that used to require a college degree now require a master's, and those that used to require a master's now require a PhD. Don't even get me started about postdocs. So at the start, I have this supposition that the primary benefit of these fellowships is as a credential that identifies you as being a certain kind of person. And that is a person who is so interested in becoming an academic that they're willing to prolong their training for an extra year just to show you that they're that kind of person. And look, I don't doubt that having that kind of credential is going to open doors for you at certain places. Maybe that's cynical. You can say, and I think it's a legitimate argument to make, well, why aren't you taking into consideration, the research skills that I learned when I was doing this academic fellowship, or the paper that I wrote when I was doing that fellowship? Maybe that's what actually opened the door. Maybe. But my problem with this is that those research skills that you learned, those papers that you wrote, people used to do those kinds of things when they first joined the faculty. It used to be that you had mentors that took you under their wing and they taught you stuff and they helped you get a foothold as a young academic. They didn't require you to remain their trainee to do it. So I got to ask, are these fellowships really necessary or beneficial, or are they just another example of credentialism and academic capitalism? Now, if you want to do one of these fellowships, or if you want to justify the need for others to do them on the grounds that the credential that you receive is going to pave the way for your academic career, I probably don't have any other rebuttal for you other than this vague sense of yearning for the not so distant past and wishing that things now aren't the way that they are. But I definitely do have something to say about this third objection that often gets tossed out to justify the need for these fellowships. But these fellowships are optional. And this is true, at least for many of the fellowships that we're talking about. Now, obviously, it's not true for all fellowships. If you want to be a rheumatologist or a gynecologic oncologist or a pediatric cardiologist or a surgical critical care physician, it's not true. For those things, you have to do the fellowship because there are board exams in those specialties, and the fellowship is required to sit for those board exams and earn the board certification and get credentialed by your hospital. But the kind of fellowship that might raise questions about its necessity, those kind of fellowships aren't usually required. They're optional. I mean, you don't have to do a fellowship in order to work at the urgent care center. You don't have to do a fellowship to run the ultrasound machine in the ED or to do an epidural in the labor and delivery ward. So sometimes the discussion about these things, it kind of devolves into some sort of individual liberty argument. Like, who are you to tell people they shouldn't pursue training that they feel they need? I mean, if someone feels like they'd benefit from some extra training and wants to do one of these fellowships, well, how does it hurt you? Just live and let live, bro. There's at least three problems with this. The first is that it ignores the potential harm to residency education of even offering these fellowships in the first place. If you decide to offer a fellowship in, I don't know, breast surgery, does that change things for residents? Does it make the program director or the program faculty wonder, I don't know, do my general surgery residents necessarily have to be doing all these breast cases? I mean, we sure could use a little extra help in clinic. or processing these discharges or staffing these consults. Maybe the junior residents can just help us out with that instead of scrubbing in on these cases. I mean, after all, if they really want to operate on these patients in the future, they're just going to do the fellowship. Or actually, maybe there's an even bigger concern, which is that maybe there's not even room for the resident to scrub in, even if they wanted to, because now the breast surgery fellow is doing all the breast cases to get their case log up. The second problem is that if you really want to take this kind of libertarian, just let people choose what they want and let the market work it out kind of approach, is that doing a whole fellowship is kind of a rigid and hierarchical way of allowing people to choose the education and training that they need. If you're making the case that residency training is adequate, but some physicians want to be more than adequate, and you want to give them the opportunity to do that, well, why don't you offer this training as CME? I mean, it may not work for everything, but for some things it seems kind of logical. Couldn't a competent radiologist learn more about interpreting cardiac imaging through a well done longitudinal CME course? Or do they have to be your fellow to gain that skill? Do you have to control their work schedule or have them put your name on all their research papers? Do they have to pledge themselves to be a vassal to the lords of the subspecialty in order for all the secrets of that subspecialty to be transmitted into their brains? Or might it be possible to have a more straightforward transaction where you just provide education in exchange for money? Because if you did it as CME, people who want that skill, they would have to pay for it. And then the invisible hand of the market could set the right price for that education. Seems like that would be the preferable approach if you were actually a free market guy. In making points one and two, I'm sort of assuming that this objection that, oh, these fellowships are just optional, that's a sincere objection. But the third problem is that all the fellowships that we have now that are mandatory, well, they all started out as something that was optional. And when you consider the incentives at play for the physicians and the programs and the accreditation and certification agencies, it's easy to see why this is the expected and predictable natural history for fellowship programs. And it's one reason why I think we all ought to be concerned about this, because it should be obvious where things are headed if we don't rethink our medical education system. And so, for sake of example, let me present to you the case of hospital medicine. There was a time when the hospital was just one of several places where a general internist or pediatrician might work. They'd see patients in their clinic and round on them if they got admitted to the hospital. And if you completed a categorical internal medicine or pediatric residency, that was felt to be adequate training to do that. And that care model might have been nice for continuity of care, but there were at least two big problems with practicing this way. One is that as a business model, it's inefficient. I mean, just from a systems engineering standpoint, you can generate more revenue per unit of time if a doctor stays in one place and the patients come to them instead of having the doctor running back and forth all day. And the other is that, as a lifestyle, it's hard. If you want to have dinner with your significant other or make it to your daughter's dance recital or I don't know, sleep through the night, you can't be running to the hospital and back all the time. And I think for many generalists, the value proposition of taking care of inpatients part time became even less favorable over time because the typical ward patient in the modern era is more acutely ill and unstable and medically complex than the typical ward patient was in previous eras. And at the same time, payers have provided more pressure in the form of DRG related payments or other schemes to get patients out of the hospital as soon as possible. So there's an even greater churn in inpatients in and out for relatively less compensation for the physician that cares for them. So for many reasons, there was an incentive for general internists or pediatricians who preferred the outpatient setting to focus on their office, and for generalists who preferred the hospital to become a new kind of doctor, an expert in hospital care called a hospitalist. If you ever hear someone speak about the history of the hospitalist specialty, I think it's a requirement that they have to pay tribute to this 1996 New England Journal of Medicine article by Dr. Bob Wachter. It gets talked about like it was a seminal moment when everything changed and hospital medicine was born, as if no one had ever had that idea until one day they went out to their mailbox and they saw it in New England Journal. But in reality, hospital-based physicians were already a part of the healthcare system in Canada and Great Britain, and they had been for a while. But What Dr. Walker did was develop a system for employing them in academic hospitals, where the previous model, which is still in place at many institutions, was that academic physicians, sometimes generalists, but sometimes specialists or even doctors whose primary focus was research, they would spend a certain number of weeks per year serving as a ward attending. And instead, what he did was work to develop a core of generalists who worked full time on the wards and focused exclusively on caring for inpatients. And that model worked well. It allowed for the outpatient generalists to focus on their clinic and for specialists to focus on their specialty. And it created a group of faculty who were passionate about inpatient care and wanted that to be the focus of their academic study and clinical expertise. And this is a good model. And it's logical to develop expertise in the care of hospitalized patients. And so soon, pediatricians, they started following this model as well. And a lot of other things started to happen. Hospitalists first formed interest groups within their professional society. Then they formed professional societies of their own. They started journals. And then they started fellowship programs. And at first, these fellowship programs, they were a little bit hard to justify because over the course of their 3-year residency, an internal medicine or general pediatric resident spends more time caring for hospitalized ward patients than quite literally any other thing that they do over the course of their residency. But don't worry, guys, don't worry. These fellowships are optional. It's just for someone who wants that extra training, or better yet, for someone who wants mentorship to jumpstart their academic career. Of course, we know how the story ends. For internists, these fellowships have remained optional, but in pediatrics, they're not. Starting 15 years ago, pediatric hospitalists began working to formalize their fellowships. They started working with the ACGME on accreditation, and they asked the American Board of Pediatrics to make a board exam and recognize them as a new specialty. And that exam has been offered for a couple of years now, and starting in 2024, there's no more grandfathering in to be a pediatric hospitalist. If you want to be a pediatric hospitalist, you got to do the fellowship. I'm not against hospitalists or hospitalism. Some of the smartest doctors I know are pediatric hospitalists. But the question is not whether doctors who specialize in something become experts at it. The question is where to draw the line. An endocrinologist who sees only patients with diabetes, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that they provide more effective or cost-effective care than an endocrinologist who also sees patients that have other endocrinologic issues. So does that mean that all endocrinologists who care for diabetes patients should complete an additional super fellowship in diabetes? I mean, these things exist. You can do it if you want to. There are institutions that offer a 1-year fellowship in diabetes to graduating endocrinology fellows. These are fellows who have already spent a significant portion of their internal medicine residency and their endocrinology fellowship managing patients with diabetes. And obviously, so far, we've chosen not to restrict the care of patients with diabetes to fellowship-trained diabetologists. Maybe in the future that'll change. Who knows? But so far, we've chosen to draw the line at the end of the endocrinology fellowship. That's as far as you're required to go. So where do we draw the line? Because for hospital medicine, we've chosen to draw it in 2 different places. If you want to care for hospitalized adult patients, well, for now at least, that's just viewed as a location where one might practice general internal medicine, and your general residency training is still adequate. But if you want to care for pediatric hospitalized patients, well, now that's something that can only be done by a hospitalist with a capital H. And starting next year, that means you're going to have to do the fellowship. Now, there's one part of the pediatric hospitalist story that I initially glossed over, so I need to return to it now. When the first generation of pediatric hospitalists were thinking about how to build up their specialty, they considered a lot of different options for doing it. This is a table that comes from an article that came out in 2012. It came out in the Pediatric Hospitalist's new journal, Hospital Pediatrics, and it includes a description of all the options that were considered by the Pediatric Hospital Medicine Strategic Planning Committee. And as you can see, there were several. They considered making a 3-year subspecialty fellowship under the ABP, or a 2-year fellowship, or a 1-year fellowship. And they considered other things too, like not having a fellowship, but building out a mandatory mentorship program, or having a hospital medicine track, including in the pediatric residency training. Again, these are the options that were considered through the lens of strategic planning. And a decade later, the option that the system pushed through was to have pediatric hospital medicine sit behind a 2 to 3-year mandatory fellowship with certification through the American Board of Pediatrics. I think it's important to look at hospital medicine through the lens of the incentives involved. Why did this option get chosen rather than some of the others? which might have been less rigid but are logical and could probably have competently trained pediatric hospitalists and improved care for pediatric hospitalized patients and allowed an academic specialty based around pediatric hospital medicine to nonetheless flourish. I think there's a few incentives. For pediatricians who have developed expertise in caring for hospitalized patients, they worked hard to acquire those skills. Some of that stuff they probably learned in their residency, but lots of other lessons they learned by working as a hospitalist. And some of those lessons were probably learned the hard way. And when they look back at their own experience, I think there's a natural human benevolent desire to make the process of acquiring their hard won knowledge and skills a little easier for those who come behind them. There's nothing wrong with that. But we should acknowledge that there's other incentives that aren't entirely benevolent. It's going to make some of you mad, but I'm going to be frank about them. One is, it's cool to think about yourself as having some kind of special expertise or being a special kind of something, but it's even cooler to have other people think of you that way. If you devote your career to learning how to do something well, it's a little off-putting to have other people go around thinking that they could just step in and do your job as well as you do it. And if you're getting mad about some of the stuff I say, you're probably trying to hear my words in that way, even though that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that there's a certain appeal in putting up a barrier that you have to cross that distinguishes you as a particular kind of person. And my point isn't that this is the driving force behind the pediatric hospitals movement, but this is human nature, and we ought to be honest about it. And if you were looking at a slate of options and you thought they were all equal and could equally generate, well-trained pediatric hospital physicians, well, stuff like this provides a little bit of gravity that pulls toward walling it off as a new specialty. And we also need to be honest about the other incentives, among which is economic gatekeeping. And this is not particular to pediatric hospital medicine. This applies to all fellowships. Again, please try to see the system here. Because once you've made your way into the green pasture, it's also human nature to want to narrow the gate that you went through, to keep so many others from following you in and grazing themselves. And one of the best ways to gatekeep is by having a board certification, because then that gives payers a way to not pay for services for providers who don't have that certification. And then they can't get credentialed with the insurance plan. Leaves more business for you, and it gives you more leverage when you're negotiating with insurers since you're now providing a more scarce service. People don't say this part out loud. If you ask, hey, why do we need this fellowship or that fellowship? You're going to get some argument that involves the need for education to improve patient care or to maintain patient safety. And those are likely motivators as well. But it's silly to act like there's not an economic incentive for practicing specialists to make it a little bit more difficult for newcomers to join their ranks. And there are other incentives for academic physicians. I mean, look, we have a system of academic medicine in this country in which success is often defined by doing less clinical work. The grunts of academic medicine, those are the docs out there laboring away, seeing patients and scrounging for work RVUs. But the real stars in the department, those are the faculty who have had their clinical time bought out by their research grant or those who have been given salary support so that they can have administrative time to become a dean or a vice president or a director of something. And even if you continue doing that grunt work of caring for actual human patients, your compensation is determined by your academic rank. So there's real financial value in getting promoted from assistant to associate or from associate to full professor. And if you make a new specialty, guess what? Somebody's got to be the program director for the fellowship. Somebody's got to be the editor of the new journal. Somebody's got to give the keynote address at the annual meeting. There's academic capital and all that. If you formalize your specialty by creating a fellowship and requiring a board certification, it becomes a rising tide that floats a lot of boats. And obviously, the coin of the realm in academic medicine, the unit of currency that gets counted up to measure you more than anything else, is the academic publication. If you want to be promoted and get that salary bump, you need as many publications as possible. And if you want to acquire this most valuable form of academic capital, well, you have an incentive to become an academic capitalist and benefit from the work of your trainees as well. And even if your fellowship is purely clinical, well, there's still obvious incentives that we have to be honest and acknowledge. If you get a fellow, well, now you got somebody to help with the rounding, or take that first call from the emergency department in the middle of the night, or write some of your notes for you in clinic or after the case is over. And be honest, those are nice things. I think we need to be honest about all these things. But I made someone real mad when I said this once. I won't say who because it's someone in my own specialty for whom I have a great deal of respect. And this person had experience as a program fellowship director and took offense to me pointing out these things. He felt that I was suggesting that program directors are exploiting their trainees like mafia captains, trying to get a piece of their research that they don't deserve, or just selfishly using their labor to elevate themselves. And for good reasons, this is not how program directors think of themselves. Program directors have to put up with a lot of crap, and a lot of their labor is unseen and thankless. The people who thrive as program directors thrive because they love to see trainees develop. It fills their bucket to see young doctors learn and grow and become, and that's what's in their consciousness. But folks, just because that's what's in your conscious mind doesn't mean that other things don't matter, especially when you're analyzing a policy issue like how should we configure training for this specialty knowledge area? There's a lot of ways you could do it. And just like the pediatric hospitalist analyzed, um, it becomes easy to see that question through a certain lens when seeing it that way gives you a more important title, or opens the door to exciting professional opportunities, or puts more money into your bank account. And there are obvious incentives to other entities too. If you go to your dean or your department chair and you say, hey, I got this great idea. It's obvious that medicine is getting more specialized, and I really want our residency graduates to be prepared for their actual careers. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to blow up the resident schedule, and we're going to allow all the residents to have more freedom to pursue training tracks that'll give them the skills that they actually need in their careers. And, the attendings might have to pitch in and cover a little bit more call, and it's going to be a lot of work for everybody. So what do you think about this? Brother, you just made a big ask. And I'm going to give you a little piece of advice here. If you ask people if they'd like to do more work, it's usually not a winning move. If you ask people if they'd like to make more money, it usually is. So if you go to your chair and you say, yo, I got this other idea. Can I be the director for a new fellowship in this pet area of expertise? And I'm going to start recruiting fellows who will help us with the call pool and increase our work RVUs and improve faculty research productivity. And who knows, maybe in a few years, it'll actually lower your faculty recruiting costs or enable some governmental subsidy that'll put even more money in our coffers. What's your boss going to say now? I don't know, son. That's an interesting proposition. Why don't you go ahead and put together a business plan? Or consider this. If you want to make a new fellowship and you go to the American board of whatever and you ask if they'd like to make an exam for it or certify that specialty, I think you're highly likely to get a receptive audience. And it's easy to make that argument just through the lens of money. So far, there have been only two administrations of the Pediatric Hospital Medicine Certifying Exam, but the registration fee for that exam is $2,900. So already that's generated over $8 million in revenue for the American Board of Pediatrics. And it doesn't stop there, of course, because all of those newly minted pediatric hospital medicine specialists, well, now they're on the hook for the next several decades of specialty maintenance of certification fees, too. And even if you think it's crass to look at this through a financial lens, if you go to a certifying organization and you ask if something ought to be certified, they're probably inclined to say yes. They're true believers. They drink the certification Kool-Aid. They're a carpenter whose only tool is a hammer. And so if you come to them with a problem, hey, what do you guys think we should do about this? They're going to see it as a nail. This is a hard problem to fix, but I think there is some hope. I say that because although I see the behavior of the overall system as being pretty malignant, I see almost all individuals as having a lot of pure motivation. The faculty who initially offer these fellowships, I think they do it because, more than anything else, they think what they're teaching is important and useful. And I think that the fellows and advanced fellows who pursue these training programs, I think they're strongly motivated by good reasons too. I think they want to improve their skills or gain some new skill that they think is going to help their patients. There are benevolent forces here that can be harnessed. And I think we would need to harness a lot of energy to overcome the inertia and the incentives in the current system and design a better one. But at some point, we're going to have to, because I'm going to tell you three things that are absolutely true. Number one is that medical knowledge and medical techniques will continue to advance. I promise this will be true. Number two is that medical practice will continue to grow more and more specialized. We can all share a nostalgic moment thinking about the days of yore when generalists took care of their patients in every way that those patients needed care from the cradle to the grave. But I'm telling you, those days are past. There's no turning back the clock. And number three is this. At a certain point, prolonging medical training more and more, it becomes unsustainable and it begins to hurt in a very measurable way the recruitment of the best and brightest to careers in medicine. Not long ago, I met someone who was almost my age, and he had not yet worked a single day as an attending physician. He started medical school in 2007. He did an MD, PhD, then he matched into a prestigious general surgery residency, the kind that has research years built in and takes 7 years to complete. And then he did a fellowship, and now he's doing an advanced fellowship. He's 16 years into training, and he's still counting. And of course, we're requiring more and more credentials just to get into medical school these days, such that many applicants need to take one or more gap years just to polish up their CVs enough to get in. You cannot tell me this process cannot be streamlined. We need to be more deliberate about choosing the portions of training that people actually need. And lots of times, I'll be the first to admit that the training that people actually need is the very training that occurs in the fellowship. If you want to be a transplant cardiologist, you don't have to convince me that it's going to help you to do an advanced cardiology fellowship in heart failure and learn how to manage LVADs and transplant patients. Your patients are going to need you to have those skills. But I'll tell you what, I'm much less convinced that your patients need you to have had 2 semesters of organic chemistry, or to have spent a full year in the anatomy lab, or a whole fourth year of medical school where 90% of your brain space was just occupied exclusively by the match. Or that your patients needed you to have spent an extra year of internal medicine residency as a chief resident just to make yourself competitive for a cardiology fellowship in the first place. The necessity of each of those things and more, all of that should be up for debate. But instead, the path of least resistance is just to add more and more onto the end, not to consider the system as a whole, just to add more and more on the end. We have to overcome that path of least resistance and make a better path. I'm going to close with a quote. It's a quote from an article in Academic Medicine in 2018. It was about the undergraduate medical school curriculum. But the point that's being made here really resonates with me, and I hope it'll resonate with you too. We have reached a point in curriculum reform where we must begin to take trade-offs seriously. We can either teach all the named foramina in the skull base or the circumstances under which a CT scan is indicated to evaluate a non-traumatic headache, but not both. We can continue to require that students memorize the mechanisms by which different classes of antibiotics kill bacteria, or how to rapidly choose and initiate empiric therapy for suspected urosepsis, but not both. We likely have time to thoroughly teach either embryology or comparative effectiveness, but not both. The time for hard choices has arrived, and a broad range of stakeholders, including ourselves as the future patients of our current students, are counting on those who control the curriculum to choose wisely. And that's it. That's it in a nutshell right there. The incentives of academic capitalism will always push us toward just extending training more and more. But what we really need to do is rethink the whole system. And that's all I've got. Actually, I lied. I got one more thing. When I make a video like this, I never know who's going to listen to it. But my hope is always that it's eventually going to find its way to the people who need to hear it. So if something I said here resonated with you, I do have an ask. Share it with someone. Same thing goes for any other video or piece of writing I've ever done. Send it to somebody else. Make them mad. Start a conversation. Maybe they'll read it or watch it or send it to somebody else. And eventually that video, or at least the arguments that it made, are going to land in the ears of someone who has a real opportunity to start influencing some of these changes. Thanks again for listening.